Where? Alrighty, well, thank you everyone and welcome today to our webinar. This is the fourth installment of the Muir Project's webinar series, Understanding the Science. It's a webinar series that we created to do a deep dive on the newest and most relevant science on topics such as wildfire, ecology, biology, and a bunch more. And we do this to get this information to the public in a universally digestible manner. In today's webinar, we are lucky enough to have with us some of the top experts in their field to guide us through adapting to wildfires, planning for the inevitable risks. And the webinar today is going to be split up into multiple parts. Each presenter is going to be discussing a different topic, and then we're going to have a small brief Q&A directly after each presenter's presentation so that we can ask questions directly to them on their topic, and then that will be followed by a larger full panel Q&A afterwards. We're asking that everyone please submit all their questions for today into the Q&A discussion board. That way they come directly to me and that they can be recorded. And any questions that don't get answered in our live discussion will be answered in our follow-up materials in a written format. And then also, as today's webinar is being recorded, that will also be redistributed to everyone, and it will be up on our YouTube page, usually within 2-3 days after the webinar. Before we begin, you should have received those 2 polling questions I was talking about, one pertaining to your scientific experience and your background, and the second about your personal interaction with wildfires. Your questions are going to be kept private, and we're only interested in this information so that we can better tailor our discussions and be respectful of people's experiences and past potential traumas. That being said, if at any point in today's webinar you're feeling uncomfortable by the discussion, feel free to message me, the host, and I will do my best to accommodate your request. With all of that out of the way, please join me in welcoming our panelists today. On this episode, we have Dr. Chad Hansen, the Principal Forest and Fire Ecologist of the Muir Project, and Dr. Kimiko Barrett with Headwaters Economics as their wildfire researcher and manager of the Community Planning Assistance Wildfire Program, and a member of the Presidential Wildfire Commission. So thank you guys so much for being here today. Thank you for being here for our discussion, and we're so excited. So with that, I will pass it off to Dr. Barrett, and please help us understand the science. Take it away.
Great, thank you. Okay, let me see. I'm going to share my screen here. If I can, host only, who can share? Let's see, there we go. Sorry about this. Okay, technology, you'd think we'd have it figured out by now. Okay, I'm getting a thumbs up. The MC, Chad, you guys are seeing my screen? Correct? All right, wonderful. So thank you so much for that introduction. As Marie-Claire said, my name is Kimmy Barrett. I'm with Headwaters Economics. And I'll talk a little bit more about who and what Headwaters Economics is in a moment. But as you can see by the title of my presentation, I'm here to discuss wildfire risk to homes and the need to adapt to the future and reality of living with inevitable wildfires. Because by adapting, what I'm really talking about is reframing the wildfire crisis, particularly here in the West, as less of a reactive response and more as a proactive anticipation of a wildfire occurring on the landscape. And by constructing, designing, and planning our homes and neighborhoods with wildfire in mind, we can create communities more resilient to increasing risks. Well, let's first start by contextualizing the wildfire problem with 3 fundamental truisms. Number 1, we know that wildfires are a natural ecological occurrence and provide valuable benefits for ecosystem functioning and landscape health. As such, they are a natural hazard. It is only when people or homes are in harm's way that a natural hazard becomes a natural disaster. Number 2, therefore, as a natural occurrence, wildfires are inevitable. They're going to happen. No matter how effective we are at containing and extinguishing a wildfire, we will never be able to prevent them all, nor the ignitions that cause them. And number 3, we do know for certain that wildfire risks are increasing and that the impacts are unequally experienced and felt from place to place and between different groups of people. So, given these facts of wildfires as inevitable natural hazards and the increasing risks, it begs the question that is wildfire disasters therefore inevitable? And the answer is no. Inevitable wildfire disaster or inevitable wildfire does not mean inevitable wildfire disasters. that we do indeed know how to do things better and how to reduce risks to people and homes by planning, anticipating, and envisioning our neighborhoods and communities with wildfire in mind. And that's what I'll be talking about today. But before I do so, I again want to reintroduce myself more formally. My name is Kimmy, and I'm with Headwaters Economics. At Headwaters Economics, we surface and interpret data to inform research, policy, and locally driven solutions so that communities and people are better prepared in a rapidly changing world. In a world, at least in my line of work and here in the West, that's increasingly on fire. So let's talk about fire. Let's talk about wildfires. So what I really want to do with this presentation is to provide three main guiding points. Number one, provide an overview of wildfire risks and trends. Number two, discuss and describe how a home burns down in the first place. Because with this knowledge, it actually simplifies the problem and makes the solution a little bit more digestible. And then number three, build off this understanding to identify some planning tools that the local scale can use to integrate wildfire risk reduction into the long-term planning and development process. So let's get started with looking at the increasing wildfire risks. What do we know? In short, wildfires are just getting much, much worse. Trends are indicating that they are increasing with respect to duration, severity, and frequency. And at the same time, we have a lot more homes being built in places that we know are going to experience a wildfire, amplifying both the risks and the costs. So breaking down these two trends in a little bit more detail, there are really three primary drivers accelerating wildfire behavior and impacts on the ground. We have climate change, decades of accumulated fuels built up, and we have very, very flammable homes placed in very, very flammable locations. So I'm going to look at these three drivers a little bit more independently. Let's look at climate change, meaning that the ambient air temperature is a lot warmer, it's a lot drier. We have prolonged droughts in many locations, again, here in the West especially. There's increasingly less predictable precipitation patterns, and we have an earlier melt off of our mountain snowpack, collectively yielding and generating very conducive conditions for extreme wildfire behavior. For instance, the average wildfire season has been extended by roughly 84 days or 3 months. In many locations, there is no longer a wildfire season or a period of time with which wildfires are most likely to occur because they're happening on a year-round basis. This is similarly indicated across the globe, with which there's been about a 20% extension in the so-called wildfire season. At the same time, wildfires are burning a lot hotter. So since 1985, the average acres of wildfires burned by these really hot, severe burning fires has increased by about 700%, with direct implications for ecological health, soil nutrients, organic materials, tree mortality, and plant regrowth. So they're burning really hot, in effect, in some situations, occurring as nuclear wildfire events, making it very hard for landscapes to return to where they were historically prior to the wildfire event. In addition to that, and amplifying this, we have a lot of accumulated fuels in many of our forests and landscapes. This is largely due to decades of very successful wildfire suppression. By wildfire suppression, I'm talking about firefighters coming in to contain and extinguish a wildfire upon initial attack. They're really, really good at this, with an average suppression rate of around 95%. As a result, we're actually spending a lot more money on wildfires as a direct correlation of increased home protection costs. So currently, we're spending about $65 million per wildfire, which is doubling the cost since 1999. Let me repeat that really quick. $65 million per wildfire at the federal level. As of this morning, there have been over 40,000 active wildfires in the country, and the season isn't over yet. In addition to that, successful wildfire suppression means that we're inadvertently excluding wildfires from the landscape, thus preventing them from doing their ecological job of coming in and removing a lot of those natural fuels. So my point is that in doing so, we're generating what is referenced as a wildfire paradox, that by suppressing a wildfire today, you're actually generating more extreme conditions for a worse wildfire in the future. And it's not that we're spending so much money on federal suppression costs, it's that we spend so little money on upfront mitigation of homes and neighborhoods so that they're better prepared before a wildfire occurs. Because as I noted earlier, the homes in these high-risk areas are incredibly flammable. And I'll talk a little bit more about that next. But we do know that increased home development in wildfire-prone areas is the fastest growing land use type in the country, with more than 1 in 3 homes now located in what is referenced as the wildland urban interface. And since 2005, we've lost over 100,000 structures to wildfires, with almost 2/3 of these located in the state of California alone. And it should be noted that these are the numbers that can be captured and quantified. We know that the real impacts of wildfires to families, neighborhoods, and businesses runs far deeper. And so while wildfire risk is certainly ubiquitous here in the 11 Western states, so too is it widespread across the country, with more than 170 million people now living in areas considered moderate to very high risk locations. We do know also that given all these concurrently rising trends, the problem is likely to get much worse in the future. Having said all that, however, I want to assure this audience that we do indeed, as I said earlier, know how to do things better. We can reduce risks to homes and neighborhoods, and in effect, create communities better adapted to wildfires. So the next question is, how do we do that? Well, to start, you must first understand how a home burns down in the first place, resulting in what is referenced as a wildfire disaster sequence. From one home burning, how it threatens neighboring structures, multiple ignitions start to result, quickly overwhelming firefighter defense forces and leading to what is considered an urban conflagration or wildfire disaster. So I'm going to talk us through this scenario here, talking through a hypothetical situation. This is a community in a high-risk area, likely where I live here in Livingston, Montana, or in another location, another community across the West that's threatened by wildfires on a frequent basis. And a wildfire breaks out and threatens those structures most adjacent to the wildland urban interface or the unbuilt vegetation. It's either a structural fire moving outwards or a wildland fire moving inwards. Regardless though, I want to bring your attention to this area that I've just highlighted with the box, again, with which those homes are abutting unbuilt vegetation or a forested landscape. This is more or less your unit of analysis when you're breaking down that sequence of events that can lead to a larger wildfire disaster. Because unlike the popular media narratives that you hear about of this tsunami or this wave of flames coming down a mountainside to burn a community down, it's actually embers that can fly anywhere from 1 to several miles ahead of a wildfire front. And if they land on any flammable surface area, they have the potential to grow in size and intensity to burn a home down. And once one home starts to burn down, it doesn't take much for neighboring structures to also be threatened. And embers actually account for 90% of all home loss during a wildfire. So let's look at this in a little bit more detail. This scene right here that I've just highlighted, again with that home sitting right up against unbuilt vegetation, looks much more like this during a wildfire. It's an ember storm. It's millions and millions of fireballs being hurled through the air far ahead of a wildfire. And as I said earlier, if they land on any flammable surface, they can grow in size and intensity to burn down a home and therefore neighboring structures as well. I want you to step back for a moment and think through what I'm saying. Flammable surfaces of a home. Think about what your own home is made of. You're dealing with a structure largely framed in wood, possibly with a wood siding or even a wooden roof. And then think about all the flammable items on and on top of it. For instance, you might have pine needles in your valleys of your roof line. You might have dead, dried vegetation and debris along your gutter systems. Think about what's on your deck, very likely also made of wood. You might have your firewood on it. You might have your propane tank from your grill or your patio furniture. Then think about the perimeter of the home. You might have lavenders or junipers or other bushes sitting up against the siding of your house. You might have bark mulch in that flower bed. And then move out into your landscaping. You have trees with some understory through it and some low-hanging branches, more bushes, more shrubs, some overgrown grasses. And then think about what's inside of your house. Here in the West, here in America really, much of what's in the interior of our homes is made of manufactured petroleum-based products. Guaranteed that home is analogous to a petrochemical fuel bomb. And when it ignites, it's going to burn. And it's going to be hot and for a long time. And the radiant heat alone from that one house burning is enough to threaten nearby structures. Once multiple structures are simultaneously ignited, as I stated earlier, they can overwhelm firefighter defense forces, and the neighborhood is therefore threatened and can lead to a larger urban conflagration or wildfire disaster. And you see this evidenced over and over in post-fire analysis in which the home is still burning amidst green canopy or green vegetation. In other words, those embers have flown ahead of the wildfire front. They've landed on a flammable surface area. They've grown to a spot fire. They've burned the structure down, while the unflammable vegetation or unflammable surface area has survived. Therefore, reducing home ignition vulnerabilities at the structure and parcel level is absolutely essential if our ultimate goal is to reduce community wildfire risk to neighborhoods. So I'm going to talk you through another video demonstration that really illustrates this. This is a duplex that was constructed by our research partners at the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety. And what you're looking at is a duplex that they built in this hangar. And on the left-hand side, you're seeing a version of it built with really traditional, very flammable building materials common throughout the Intermountain West. On the right-hand side, you're seeing the same version of that duplex, except it's using wildfire-resistant building materials. At the same time, the entire structure is being exposed to these gigantic ember chambers, which is hurling embers with equal speed and velocity at both sides of the structure. And they're just testing to see which building products, which flammable surface areas ignite first under these exposed embers. So let's take a look, and I'm going to talk you through it. We're about 4 minutes into the demonstration so far. And as you can see on the left-hand side, the bark mulch has quickly ignited. That's not surprising. Mulch is often chemically treated, and it's a large surface area. This is spreading the flames both vertically as well as horizontally. So it's starting to move upwards up the side of the house, which has cedar siding, and into that open eave spaces of the roof line. It will quickly penetrate through the attic vents and into the interior of the home through the attic space. Think about what's in your attic. It's often, old blankets, Christmas decorations, furniture, other very flammable products. On the exterior of the home, the flames are starting to also move horizontally, moving underneath the decking material, also made of wood, and igniting it on fire from underneath. This will quickly expose the door on fire, also made of wood. And then the windows are all single pane, meaning that they can easily burst under any intense, prolonged heat. And like the attic, allow flames into the interior of the home, burning it from the inside out. The right-hand side, you're not seeing a lot happening over here. Again, this is a version of the home built with ignition-resistant building materials. That means fiber cement siding, a metal door, decking material that's been treated with fire retardant, pea mulch. There's no vegetation up against the side of the home, and the windows are dual paned. They repeated this experiment 3 different times, and every time the home on the left was consumed in flames within 10 minutes, while the home on the right survived with minimal smoke damage. So as I stated earlier, we do indeed know how to do things better. We know how to use the best available science, engineering, and research to build homes safer and smarter in wildfire-prone areas. So now that we know how a home burns down, how do we actually prevent it? And this is where community planning tools can help. And by planning tools, I'm talking about land use planning measures. Land use planning tools that are already part of that land use planning toolkit that can be used to explicitly integrate wildfire risk reduction into the development and planning framework. And this planning has to occur at multiple scales, moving both laterally as well as vertically. So at the broad federal level, you're talking about transboundary partnership and understanding and recognizing that wildfire risks know no boundaries, and that reduction of those risks must occur in tandem with both the built and the unbuilt environment. At the state level, you're talking about building codes or vegetation management resource codes that address high hazard locations and new development. And then at the local county jurisdictional level, it's things like open space initiatives, subdivision design standards, zoning ordinances, and other planning measures that integrate wildfire mitigation into how that community envisions growing and sustaining alongside these increasing wildfire risks. And then all of this, of course, is heavily supported and subsidized by funding at the state and federal government level. A couple of examples of how this has been used. Recently, Portola Valley, California supplemented the statewide building code with a home hardening ordinance, requiring all new construction in high hazard areas integrate the most restrictive wildfire resistant building materials and design into new development. Similarly, Summit County, Colorado has adopted an ordinance that requires fencing material within 10 feet of the home be constructed with non-combustible building products, therefore reducing the ability for a fence, often made of wood, to serve as a wick, leading wildfire directly to the home itself. They also don't allow any combustible materials like firewood within 30 feet of the home during high risk times of the year. And then the city of Austin recently adopted a wildland urban interface code, the largest metropolitan area to do so in the country. Again, regulating construction materials, design, and landscaping for new construction in high risk locations. So these are just a couple of examples of communities that are taking action to address this. What can we do to scale this up? Well, if our ultimate goal is to reduce wildfire risk to communities, then we must deliberately and intentionally invest in communities. Investment in the form of public and private collaborations, homeowner incentive programs, technical assistance for lower capacity communities, subsidies and services to support communities and populations disproportionately impacted, and other unique opportunities that start at the local scale. Because these impacts, these wildfire realities that we're talking about today in this webinar are being felt, experienced, and responded to at the community level. And it's the communities that are stepping up to take action to address long-term resilience against increasing risks. And we know that, in fact, upfront investment yields long-term benefits. In a recent study done in 2019 by the National Institute of Building Sciences and FEMA, they found that for every dollar spent on upfront wildfire mitigation, yielded $4 back in long-term benefits and savings. But we also know that communities cannot do this alone. They need the resources, funding, and network of invested partnerships from both the public and private arena. They need support to build capacity. So rather than responding and reacting to a wildfire disaster, communities are better prepared and equipped before a wildfire strikes. And because we can solve this problem if we define the problem as one involving people and communities alongside wildfire. And in fact, to some degree, we've actually solved this problem before in the past. I work very frequently with a wildfire historian named Stephen Pine out of Arizona University. He's one of the leading authorities who establishes the relationship between evolving societies and wildfire. And he always shares this anecdotal history note with me. And that when you look at the westward progression in the 1800s across the country, we built entire cities and urban areas that kept repeatedly and commonly burning down from wildfires. For 1871, for instance, the Chicago and Peshtigo fire killed 1,700 people and caused the evacuations of hundreds of thousands of people. 1,700 people in a wildfire. That's astronomical. We wouldn't even stand for that this time. And in 1906, following the San Francisco wildfire, we as a society fundamentally decided to do things differently. We started to use non-combustible building materials in our structures. We stopped using sawdust for insulation. We stopped using timber for exterior walls, and we stopped using wooden shingles in our roofs. Wooden boardwalks were replaced with concrete material and fire hydrants were installed. Evacuation protocols were put in place and emergency exits were installed, as well as interior sprinklers. So we don't have that same level of urban structural fires anymore because of those early and very deliberate decisions and actions. So we've solved this before from an urban planning perspective. We can solve it again if we apply those same principles to the wildland urban interface, and if we start to define the wildfire crisis as a home ignition problem and not as a wildland fire problem. And with that, I will leave my contact information before we turn it over for some questions and then Dr. Hansen's presentation.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Great. So we have a couple questions here for you. One of the main priority ones that kind of popped up is, why do we keep building in fire-prone areas when science and real-time experiences are clearly showing us not to? And if you could speak a little bit to that.
Why? Because we can. Right? Because it's the way with which we have developed, and there's, it's not a simple question, but in some situations, there's house affordability, there's market factors in play there. There may be no other areas to build in, so it forces development in high-risk areas. In other places, again, here in the West, there's ample real estate opportunity, so you can build, and some of these places offer high amenities, both naturally as well as recreationally. They're gorgeous locations to live in, and as such, they are also equally exposed to wildfires. So, this is something we are anti-regulatory in our culture. So without some sort of measure or implication in place that would prevent us from building there, there's really no reason for us not to.
Got you. Thank you for that. And then I have another one here about the role of homeowners insurance and how does that playing a role, and how do you find that to be both challenging in implementation of your work and your studies?
Yes. So the role of insurance companies is a great question to ask. We get asked this very frequently. And they really, until recently, and by that I'm talking about fires that occurred 2015 and onwards, have not been dominant players in the wildfire space, simply because when you look at submitted claims from wildfires, it's still a drop in the bucket when you compare it to other natural hazards. So insurance companies are starting to really come to the forefront of these conversations, particularly when it talks about incentivizing homeowners to take the steps necessary. But really, they should not be relied on as a responsible provider or player in addressing or resolving the wildfire crisis. They should be part of the conversation, but for many reasons, from the market side of things to their inability to, actually talk and converse with one another about a mutual approach to wildfire risk reduction, insurance companies, it's easier for them to drop a policy currently than it is to actually work with homeowners in many situations. That is starting to change in places across the country where they are either forced by state or local government that they are not allowed to, such as California has a moratorium in place. They're not allowed to drop insurance coverage, but they are one of many players in this field that we need to think about and consider.
Awesome. And then kind of a more logistical question here about and speak to it if you can about like cost for retrofitting homes and how that plays into better community defense overall, and how we can incentivize people to adopt these, more fire conscious practices.
Yeah, it's a great question. Retrofitting costs is great because we know building codes, any regulatory measures only address new development. So addressing the huge existing fleet of homes that predate any building code is a massive undertaking. And so when you look at the cost for this, it's going to range depending on what is the feature or the component of the home that you are seeking to retrofit. If it's a roof, we do know that that's going to cost a little bit more money if you're replacing it, with a metal roof. Having said that, however, when you're talking about wildfire resistant standards, then asphalt shingles suffice. They are considered wildfire resistant. Many, many homes already have asphalt shingled roofs. There are many homes that have wood shake shingle roofs still. We've just done a quick analysis using Zillow data, and we found that particularly in California, wood shake shingles are still very, very common if they've been predate the 2008 Chapter 7A building code. At a minimum, at the country, you're looking at $6 billion investment in just roof replacements for those assessed properties. So we're talking about billions and billions of dollars needed to actually retrofit existing homes with wildfire resistant standards and components, which means that homeowners should not be called upon to bear that weight alone. There should be money supported at the federal level to help subsidize homeowners to meet these mitigation standards. And right now, there is nothing within the federal or state. Well, California is starting to work at this, but there's nothing certainly at the federal level in terms of grants or subsidies to homeowners to harden their homes against these increasing wildfire risks.
Awesome. And then kind of, we'll take one more question before we pass it over to Chad. And then just reminding our participants, we will have Chad do a small Q&A after his presentation, and then an overall discussion with all the panelists. So if your question wasn't answered right now, I'm potentially saving it for a more better time to address it later in the presentation as an FYI. But this last question for you, Dr. Barrett, in terms of leading into this, federal and state level issue of funding and help with the Wildfire Commission that you are a part of, and that's really exciting. Can folks then expect like some changes to be on the way? And if we can't speak to that fully, I can also just kind of push that over to Chad about how to set the frame for the, overarching federal and state discussion.
Yeah, I mean, is there a chance to reframe the political paradigm and social cultural paradigm with which we approach wildfires? Absolutely. I think none of us would be doing what we do if we don't believe that fundamentally. You have to have faith that we're reaching a threshold, a critical mass threshold with which transformative changes are needed, both politically as well as socially. And this is huge. The political policy aspect is one piece of it, but the social expectations and assumptions we have as a culture to be rescued or saved from a wildfire is also requiring some adjustment if we're going to recalibrate our political framing as well. We can no longer expect to be saved from wildfires as we have traditionally in the past. And it should be noted, no other natural hazard would ever have that set of expectations placed on it. We would never put other people in harm's way if our flood was going to come through our home or from sea level rise. And yet we have this with wildfires. And so as much as a political reframing is needed, also a social and cultural paradigm shift is also required.
Awesome. Thank you so very much. I really appreciate you taking the time, and we will hop back again at our end of the webinar discussion. So with that, Dr. Hansen, would you mind taking us on the next leg of our presentation?
Of course, sharing my screen here. Let me know if that comes through okay. Good deal. All right. So I'm Dr. Chad Hansen. I'm a forest and fire ecologist, and I'm going to be talking about another key aspect of this issue, which is the narrative that we're hearing a lot from some state and federal land management agencies that somehow they can stop fires from reaching towns through forest management. And basically, the message that communities are receiving is this notion that somehow they don't really need to worry as much about home hardening and defensible space pruning. They don't need to worry as much about evacuation plans or any sort of real community-based fire safety measures. They don't prioritize that because what they're hearing is, we've got you covered. We're going to do these forest management projects out in the remote forest wildlands, and we'll stop the fire from reaching the town. And so I want to explore that a little bit here today and focus on that because from my perspective, that narrative is one of the largest impediments to political change and policy change that would otherwise focus resources and attention on the sorts of community protection measures that Dr. Barrett was talking about. I talk a lot about this in my book Smokescreen, which I came out with last year, and that's available on Amazon and bookshop.com, and also through the publisher, University Press, Kentucky. So I'm just going to talk about a few key things here. One is, interestingly, there's this notion that if you have denser forests out in the wildlands, that somehow that's going to burn much more intensely. And it seems intuitively obvious because if you have more trees, if you have more biomass, people think, well, of course, there's more fuel and it's going to burn more intensely. On the one hand, superficially, that's true. On the other hand, there are countervailing factors that occur in denser forests. For example, more canopy cover. More canopy cover means more cooling shade. More cooling shade means fewer dry grasses and other really combustible material in the understory because they're not getting as much sunlight. It means everything stays more moist in the understory during fire season. And a denser stand of trees actually acts as a buffer against the winds that drive the flames. In essence, what you have with a denser, more carbon-rich stand of forest is a microclimate that is a little bit more shielded from extreme weather driven by climate change. And for that reason, there's a lot of research finding that denser forests tend to burn at equal or lower intensities during wildfires. Now, interestingly, there's a lot of research on this one too, that the notion that if forests haven't burned in a very long time, that they'll burn much more intensely. And what most of the research is finding on this is that forests that haven't burned in a very long time burn at equal or lower intensities when fires occur, probably for similar microclimate reasons that I just discussed. Now, one key caveat on this, if forests have burned recently, like within the last 10 years, they definitely will burn at lower intensity. And what I believe is the main conclusion from the research is that the main effect of fire suppression in terms of fire spread and severity is really about what happens in those first 10 years or so after the last fire. But interestingly, after that, there's not a continual increase in potential for more and more severe fire with every passing decade. And that's really important to understand because what's happening right now is that the densest, oldest forests, the ones that are typically the least likely to burn more intensely, those are being targeted by logging operations under the rubric of commercial thinning based on the notion that if they haven't burned in a long time and they're very dense, they're going to be the greatest fire hazard. And what we're finding in most of the research, there is some research from the Forest Service stating the opposite, but most of the research has found methodological flaws in those Forest Service studies. Most of the research is finding that those densest, most long unburned forests are actually not a higher fire hazard, and if anything, they may be a little bit less. one of the key reasons, again, and I can't emphasize this enough, is that forest fires are driven mostly by weather and climate factors, and therefore also by climate change. It's not primarily about how dense the forest is. It's not primarily about how many live trees there are, how many dead trees there are, how many down logs there are. Those factors can be relevant, certainly, but not always in the way we think they will be. Bottom line is that it's really mostly about weather and climate. And forests with the fewest environmental protections and the most tree removal tend to burn more severely most of the time. Now, there's obviously lots of exceptions at local scales, and you can always find areas where there was a commercial thinning operation and the forest burned at low intensity. And every fire season, any big fire, the Forest Service and logging industry will find those examples and take reporters to those specific locations again and again and say, look, thinning works. But they're ignoring the more numerous examples over the ridge where those thinned areas burned at a moderate or high intensity. These findings are from Bradley et al. 2016. I'm a co-author of that study. This is the largest scientific analysis ever done at the landscape scale on this question. We looked at 3 decades of data and the entire Western United States, over 1,500 fires. And these are very, very robust findings. But again, main thing is this is mostly about hot, dry, windy conditions in a drought year, and you cannot fight the wind with a chainsaw. And for these reasons, what many researchers are finding is that when the forests are reduced in their density, when many of the trees, especially mature trees, are removed, in other words, when there's a reduction in canopy cover, which typically comes from commercial thinning, which invariably removes a lot of the mature trees and even old growth trees in many cases, that often increases fire intensity. And in the different scenarios, you'll see in this example, some scenarios it went down, some scenarios it went up. On balance, it went up in more scenarios than it went down. So you always get variability. But the point is that this notion that if you remove a bunch of trees from the forest, that it will consistently curb fire behavior, that's not being borne out by most of the research. Interestingly as well, because of the microclimate effects that I discussed, when you remove trees from the forest, you reduce the canopy cover, especially if you're removing mature trees through commercial thinning. You reduce the canopy cover, you reduce the windbreak effect of the forest, and you get hotter, drier, windier conditions. And this is a quote from Stevens et al. 2021, and basically finding that those microclimate effects from commercial thinning lead to a faster rate of spread for wildfires. And that simply means that fires are going to reach towns faster if the landscape has been commercially thinned, and the fires are going to get bigger faster. Now, I looked at this from a soil severity standpoint in my study last year of the Creek Fire, which burned in 2020, 380,000 acre fire in the southern Sierra Nevada. And one of the big conversations there was there were large patches of tree mortality from a previous drought that happened several years earlier. And a lot of those dead trees had broken off and some had fallen on the ground. And the narrative was that that must have driven the fire. That must have been the big factor. And also that the forests were too dense and that there were some previous fires. And there must have been a lot of fuel from those previous fires. So I looked at this. And what I found is that the highest levels of high severity, the highest percentages of high severity, were actually in the forests that had the most intensive logging based on the rubric, based under the rubric of fuel reduction. So commercial thinning and post-fire logging. All this logging done under the guise of fuel reduction, those areas actually tended to burn overall more severely. Forests that had burned previously and had not been post-fire logged and then burned again had pretty low severity overall. And general federal forest lands were kind of intermediate. And this is what one of those, I'm showing a few examples here. Of course, there was variability in all these areas in every category, low, moderate, and high. But this is just one example of a very, very dense forest that had no previous management. It hadn't burned in many decades. And the fire just crept through as a very low intensity surface fire. There was only seedlings really were killed in this stand. And the reason for that is, of course, the weather conditions were conducive to low intensity fire. When the fire burned through this area, it was cooler, the wind had died down, the relative humidity had gone up. Same thing in this stand, very, very dense stand, incredibly high biomass, hadn't burned in many decades, no previous management, and in this area for a long time. And you can see it burned at very low intensity, some seedlings and saplings killed. This is an area that was commercially thinned and burned. This is a large area that was commercially thinned. This is thousands of acres, these areas oftentimes. And you have large high severity fire patches. High severity fire patches, in some cases, 1,000, 2,000 acres in size or even larger, mostly commercially thinned. And the main reason, of course, is that the weather conditions were conducive to high severity fire here, hot, dry, windy conditions. But commercial thinning was a secondary exacerbating factor because of the microclimate effects that I talked about earlier. The notion that these more open forests from commercial thinning, where there's fewer what they call ladder fuels, that will consistently burn at lower intensity, that's not being borne out by the data. This stand also commercially thinned. You can see the stump holes where they were, the remaining stumps were kind of basically incinerated by the flames. And you can see this was a very, very open forest here. There was wide spacing between the trees. It was commercially thinned. And this area burned at very, very high intensity. It was an active crown fire. And so were the areas around it that have been commercially thinned. In fact, one whole slope, thousands of acres burned like this. This area is Southern California Edison lands. They have thousands of acres next to Shaver Lake, the town, that they had been commercially thinning and also prescribed burning for about 40 years. And this is actually where some of the highest levels of high severity fire occurred in the entire creek fire. So point is, of course, there are areas that were thinned that burned at low intensity, and there are lots of areas that were unthinned that burned at high intensity as well. There's lots of variability, but on average, the areas with more forest management, more logging and tree removal under the guise of fuel reduction, both commercial thinning and post-fire logging, they tended to burn at higher severity, not lower. This is an area that was post-fire logged from an earlier fire and then reburned in the creek fire. As you can see, it burned almost exclusively at high severity. I found similar result in the Antelope Fire of 2021. I published those results earlier this year in Hansen 2022. I looked at the tree mortality, not just from the fire, but also from thinning prior to the fire. And I call this cumulative severity, because the problem is Forest Service researchers have been churning out studies for the last 20 years and saying, well, we think thinning might be effective in this place because it burned at slightly lower severity. But they don't take into account the tree mortality from thinning itself, which is a major source of bias because it's oftentimes very significant. And what I found is that when you include both sources of mortality, the cumulative severity is significantly higher in commercial thinning units relative to mature unthinned forests in the same fire. Found the same thing in a study Bryant Baker and I just published more recently regarding the Caldor Fire of 2021. Cumulative severity was significantly higher in commercial thinning units than in unthinned forests. And this is a really big deal because there was a number of commercial thinning projects that the Forest Service did adjacent to near towns, but they didn't prioritize defensible space. They didn't prioritize thinning small trees within 100 or 200 feet of homes. Instead, they prioritized commercial thinning units further out in the wildlands, removing mature fire-resistant trees that are commercially valuable to the logging industry and to the Forest Service. And the Forest Service did one of these logging projects called the Trestle Project in the years prior to the Caldor Fire, south of the town of Grizzly Flats. And what they told the public, what they told the town, was that the commercial thinning units would slow or stop a wildfire, even under high fire weather conditions. And so again, people thought, well, I don't need to worry. I don't need to do that defensible space. I don't need to put those ember-proof vents on my home. I don't need to sweep those dry pine needles and leaves off my roof because the Forest Service is telling me that this logging project out there over the ridge is going to stop the fire from reaching the town. And the Forest Service even had graphics showing this. And actually, those lines there are basically the Forest Service claiming that when the fire reaches those commercial thinning units, which are the kind of green and purple modeled areas, that the fires will just stop. A fire would just simply stop and it wouldn't reach the town. This is what actually happened in the Caldor fire. You can see Grizzly Flats on the western side, the left side of the image. The fire started on the southwestern portion here. You can see there's a little icon showing the ignition point, and then it spread north toward Grizzly Flats. Those black diagonal crosshatch areas are commercial thinning units that happened in years prior to the Caldor fire. And you can see that the fire burned right through those commercial thinning units and burned down the town of Grizzly Flats. Grizzly Flats is basically mostly gone now. And this was preventable. This was preventable if the focus had been on home hardening and defensible space and evacuation assistance. And in fact, you can see that those commercial thinning units in those first few days of the fire, where the fire weather was most extreme, because again, it's mostly about weather and climate, those commercial thinning units burned almost exclusively at high severity during that really high fire weather. And so did the unthinned forests. They burned mostly at high severity too, because that's what the weather dictated. In contrast, on the eastern side of the Caldor fire, in the community of Myers, just south of South Lake Tahoe, the homeowners are much more wealthy, and they were able to do their defensible space. They were able to do their home hardening, and they did that with little difficulty. In addition, the Forest Service did a little bit of very light pruning and extended that defensible space about a couple hundred feet from the homes, a very, very narrow boundary next to the homes of defensible space pruning. This was not logging. There was really no discernible change in the canopy cover. But in combination with water drops next to those homes from fire suppression forces, it was highly effective. The fire stopped in those defensible space zones, a couple hundred feet or less from the homes. Whereas in the commercial thinning units out in the wildlands, those green and purple areas, further out, away from those little kind of narrow oval shaped areas that I show. That's the defensible space, those narrow oval areas, horizontal and vertical. That's right next to the home boundary. The green and purple areas out further into the fire, those are just out in the wildlands. Those are commercial thinning units. And the fire just burned right through that. No problem at all, just like it did elsewhere. Same thing, of course, happened in the Camp Fire of 2018. The Forest Service and private logging companies did enormous amounts of logging under the rubric of fuel reduction, both post-fire logging and commercial thinning. And they explicitly told the town that it would save them from fire. It would stop the fire from reaching the town. It would drop down to a low intensity surface fire and either stop or burn at such low intensity fire suppression forces could easily put it out. Forest Service did a 1,500 acre commercial project, mostly commercial thinning. They called the Concow project. It was commercial thinning and also some post-fire dead tree removal for biomass mostly. And 1,500 acres, a couple million board feet of timber removed. And they explicitly said it would protect the town from fire. Camp Fire burned through those areas that had been very heavily logged under the rubric of fuel reduction on public and private lands. That's the area it burned through the fastest, burned about 3 miles an hour between the point of origin and the town. People had very, very little time to evacuate. 86 people lost their lives and over 14,000 homes were burned. And again, this was avoidable. This was preventable if we focused in the right way on the community itself, not in backcountry logging. There was a trio of articles last year by a number of Forest Service scientists in the journal Ecological Applications, Pritchard et al., Hagman et al., and Hesberg et al. And these studies, these articles have been cited heavily by the Forest Service to say, well, thinning works, it's the way we should go. We should focus on commercial thinning in remote backcountry forests, and obviously what that means is not on communities. And one thing I just wanted to mention here is that not only were these articles biased in the sense that they did not include entire stacks of reply articles from scientists in the peer-reviewed literature that rebutted and refuted the studies by the Forest Service scientists that were cited. But in addition, even this trio of articles acknowledged repeatedly that commercial thinning can increase fire rate of spread, can increase fire intensity and severity. for a host of reasons, mostly as a result of the changes in microclimate, but also because of slash debris and the spread of invasive combustible grasses like cheatgrass, which is spread by logging machinery. And so you can see these quotes there. These are quotes from these Forest Service studies, mostly from Pritchard et al. 2021, acknowledging, of course, that that these practices can very often be counterproductive. And in fact, they cited a number of studies to say that, well, there is evidence that thinning is very effective. Well, when we look at these studies, these are Forest Service funded studies again, these are previous ones. When we look at them more closely, what we find, and we discussed this in the Della Sala et al. 2022 article that we published more recently, what we find, and we have a whole section of this in Della Sala et al. 2022, that a lot of these studies have results that actually contradict the conclusion that's stated in the abstract. So the abstract will say, well, we find that fuel reduction from commercial thinning is effective at curbing wildfire and stopping wildfire, and the results say something quite different. Oftentimes, the results indicate that the thinned areas burned it more severely and were not effective at all, especially compared to things like prior fire, whether it's prescribed or wildfire. And I'll briefly address one more issue before we go to the broader Q&A, which is this notion that dead trees are a key driver of increased fire severity. There's certainly some Forest Service studies that claim that. There's some variability in the research, but I will say that the great majority of the research, including by far and away the largest and most comprehensive studies, such as Hart et al. 2015 and Hart and Preston 2020, and also Meigs et al. 2016. Most of those studies are finding that forests that have more dead trees and down logs actually burn at equal or lower intensities. This study found that they actually burn less severely, but a lot of the studies find that there's just no relationship. I looked at this in the Creek Fire. I found no relationship between pre-fire deadwood density and fire severity. There was just no relationship. One of the factors that I believe is occurring here is that people forget that down logs are like sponges. They soak up and retain huge amounts of water. They can actually hold 25 times more water per cubic area than the surrounding soil, including during a drought year. So it's important to keep in mind that it's much more complex fire behavior in forests than simply thinking, well, there's too many dead trees or there's too many live trees, too much fuel, it's going to burn more intensely. It can be often much more complicated than that for reasons that have to do with microclimate and water retention in live and dead trees. So I will leave it there and stop screen sharing, and looking forward to any questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Alrighty. And with that, we're going to dive right into our full panelist Q&A. And we've got some really good questions here. I'm going to start. There's one here that says, is the Forest Service and other federal agencies like FEMA able to help communities through home hardening and defensible space practices, as well as firewise? How can communities go about demanding our government work more from a home outward perspective versus backcountry? And I can put that to both of you.
Happy to have Dr. Barrett address that first. I have a couple of thoughts too, but I can go second.
Sure. So I think it's important to note that when it comes to wildfire, really we're talking about USDA and a handful of other federal land management agencies that address that. None of them have expertise when it comes to built environment, infrastructure, or home hardening mitigation. They will often defer to either FEMA or HUD to resolve this, neither of which are pre-planning disaster agencies. HUD is trying to get there. FEMA is trying to shift as well, but I honestly think are at least a decade away from that actually happening. You look at things like the BRIC grant coming through FEMA, almost 96% of that funding went to coastal cities experiencing urban issues and sea level rise. Very, very little of it goes to wildfire issues. So this, whether we like it or not, is going to be in the hands of places like the Forest Service, DOI, and other federal land management agencies who do not yet have the expertise or capacity to address home hardening. All of that to say is that until they professionalize that as part of their expertise, there's no funding and there is no support for mitigation measures to home or parcel level efforts that are so much needed at this point.
Yeah, and I would agree with that, and I would add that in part it's because of a lack of expertise, but also in part it's because of a lack of funding and prioritization from Congress. So the Forest Service is in many ways just kind of a victim of the same problem, because the policies are ultimately coming from Congress, and that's why people really need to put pressure on members of Congress to change direction. I'll just give a couple of examples here. There was a bill that was passed by the House just several weeks ago. It hasn't been taken up by the Senate yet. I hope it will not be, because it's so wrongheaded. But it's called the Wildfire Package, basically, and it passed the House. It was a bunch of different bills that were combined into a large package. Just from the standpoint of from the wildlands in versus from the home out, the wildfire package allocated about $1 billion a year to vegetation management out in wildlands, and most of that would go to logging. And only less than $10 million a year, about $7 million specifically, to home hardening. And that's basically a more than 100-to-1 ratio in favor of backcountry forest management or other vegetation management versus home hardening. And it was basically presented as a community protection legislative package. Now, we know that that kind of allocation is not effective. We know that that's going to lead to more of these home losses and even losses of lives. And so policymakers really need to get the message, because they could change that ratio to 99, 100-to-1 for home hardening and defensible space, and actually say, hey, Forest Service, we want you to prioritize this, and we want you to start prioritizing this in terms of your research, in terms of your technical expertise. It would follow, but for right now, Congress is still listening more to the logging industry than they're listening to scientists who are more concerned about community safety.
Thank you, everybody. And then I feel like we need to quick address this. There seems to be some difference of opinions in our questions from the audience, and almost like putting it to that you two are at odds, which we're most definitely not. I think that we share so much in common than we have anything that separates us. So I would love to put that kind of perspective to you two to go into those nuances. Dr. Barrett, if you wouldn't mind addressing some of those, that would be great.
Yeah, if I recall, I think the question is with respect to severity was the question that we came from. So I was saying wildfire acreages have increased with respect to severity. I was talking with reference to suppression. I'm not talking about forest treatments in the light that Dr. Hansen was talking about, but I think both of us are in agreement that there are pockets of increasing severity. Again, my reference is to suppressing a wildfire, which is a different approach, different policy, different framework than forest treatments. So I would defer to Dr. Hansen on the forest treatment side. I think what we're both mutually agreeing to is that wildfires in areas that have had preferably no forest management intervention are needed and valuable and natural, and that is where you're seeing things that should be happening the way that we would consider historically or traditionally more common with respect to wildfire behavior. But I would defer to Dr. Hansen on the forest treatment side.
Yeah, I think we're very much in agreement. So there's a couple of different ways to look at the trends in high severity fire in particular. One is in terms of area. High severity fire has been increasing because fire as a whole has been increasing. Low, moderate, and high severity fire have all been increasing because we've had more fire. And a lot of that, of course, is driven by climate change. And so there definitely is a trend there. It's an upward trend. There's no question about that. Climate change is a significant factor. Now, I think for me, the good news is that when we look at another different way to look at severity, which is percent high severity in an individual fire on average, most of the research finds that the percent high severity is not increasing. So even though the acreage of high severity is going up, just like the acreage of low and moderate is going up, the average individual fire is not getting more severe in forests, at least so far, according to most of the research. Now, again, there's some variability in the research there too. Forest Service has a few studies out there saying that their fire severity as a percentage has increased too. Most of the research finds the opposite and is questions some of the methods of some of the Forest Service research. So I think we're very much in agreement because, to me, it's really about the area is actually, a very relevant factor in terms of what's happening for fire patterns and trends. And one of the key pieces of context there from my standpoint is are we within the natural range of variability? Do we have too much fire in the forest, or do we have too little? Do we have it, about right? In most forests, we're still less than we had historically, although we are getting closer because of fire has been going up. So, what I always say is we don't want too much fire. We don't want too little fire of any severity or intensity. Right now, we're still on the low side in most forest ecosystems. And so I don't lament an increase so long as it doesn't become unnaturally high. I don't think that's going to happen because of various feedback loops, especially that first 10-year period after the last fire. As you get more fires run into a previous fire that burned less than 10 years earlier. And that ends up being a pretty significant factor. And that is really a key thing that fire suppression has done, is taken away that kind of previous 10-year frequency of fires running into a previous fire, like Dr. Barrett mentioned. That actually ends up being a really significant factor when you have fire suppression.
Okay, well, thank you for that clarity. This was an interesting one. The WUI doesn't seem to actually be defined. So how would each of you take that into consideration and define it for yourselves?
And it's a great question. I take that one first. I would say that the WUI is the Western states right now. We are living in a wildfire prone area and a landscape that has grown with wildfire. And so there are very, very few places in the 11 Western states that you can escape or get away from wildfire risk, particularly when you start thinking about things like ember exposure. And the fact that, as Dr. Chad and I have talked, or Dr. Hansen and I have talked about previously, most wildfires actually occur on grass and rangelands. So there are very few places that you're not going to have at least a minimal exposure to wildfire. So the wildland urban interface is, it's a generic term. It's used quite often in wildfire rhetoric to define an area, but I would say that there is no categorical area for the WUI. It's where we live and recreate and visit here in the American West.
Yeah, and I would add to that, just to kind of underscore a point that Dr. Barrett made during her presentation. And I believe, if I recall correctly, the term is the home ignition zone. I really think the conversation needs to be about the home ignition zone, primarily because people understand when you're talking about the home ignition zone, sometimes people call it the defensible space zone, but you're talking about a zone right around individual structures, which is where our focus needs to be. The structure itself, number one, and number two, the immediate vicinity around the structure. The concern that I have about the term wildland urban interface, I used to use the term all the time. I don't use it so much anymore because it's become so amorphous, and regionally it's defined so differently. Some states define it in ways that you've got 4 or 5 miles away from the nearest home or community. You're out in the wildlands, and they're calling it the WUI. So I think that term has become muddled, and I prefer to focus on terms that really necessarily focus the attention on the home itself and its immediate vicinity.
Awesome. Thank you for that. Okay. We have another question here about, it's kind of a two-part question. So how can communities encourage a fire-wise mentality at a local level? Followed up with a question about, can you speak to the effectiveness or ineffectiveness of the fire-wise branding? Is it helping or hurting our communities?
I can go with that one first as well. So, there is, FireWise is a great program out there that really speaks to the education and awareness raising of homeowners around their risk. And it does try and get to that parcel level of understanding that both Dr. Hansen and I have found so important. The challenge with it is that it's voluntary, and they set it up as such. We now know that voluntary measures can only go so far, because if one homeowner does everything that they need to do to mitigate their house and their structure and property, but their neighbor does nothing, then that home is still exposed and threatened to a wildfire ignition, again, simply due to the radiant heat from that other home burning. So these measures, these mitigation practices we've been talking about, have to be applied across the board. They have to go across the neighborhood. And really the only mechanism that enables that level of enforcement has to be regulatory in nature, as we have done with seismic hazards in the past, and we are starting to do with flood and sea level rise and these other natural hazards. So FireWise, again, is a great benefit for educational awareness and increasing homeowner acknowledgement of their risk, but it it's not the kind of, solution to everything simply because it's based on a voluntary mechanism to begin with. I think there are some great programs out there that really try to build off FireWise practices. They bring in the planning department, the fire districts, the insurance companies to really try and incentivize some of these efforts that occur at a local scale. And for example, I'm thinking of Wildfire Partners based in Boulder County, Colorado, that works with insurance providers to actually guarantee insurance coverage if homeowners have met these mitigation measures and defensible space requirements. So there's unique opportunities for public-private collaborations that really try and draw on this and build off of what FireWise has already established.
And I agree with all that and don't have anything to add to that answer.
Awesome. Okay. We have there's great questions coming into the chat. So just thank you to all our participants. And just a reminder, if none of your questions get answered in our live discussion, in our follow-up materials, there will be written responses from both presenters to everyone who has registered. So bear with me as I sort through these. Let's see. Okay. We have a question here saying, how much difference is there in types of forest and how they respond to fire, i.e. tree species, age of forest, climate of the forest area? I feel like we can maybe piggyback between the two of you for that one.
I mean, certainly there's differences in fire regimes in different forest types. Boreal forests, tend to burn hotter on average than forests that are a little further south. Forests in the east don't have exactly the same fire regimes as forests in the west. They still have fire regimes and they still have a mixed intensity fire regime, but they tend to be more on the low and moderate end of things. Different forest types have different fire regimes. But I think the common denominator is, as Dr. Barrett mentioned in her presentation, fire is a natural and necessary ecological force in these forests. In most of our forests, we have less fire than we had historically. And we need to allow fire to serve its natural role, including that mix of fire intensities, because a lot of species depend on those high intensity fire patches. A lot of them have evolved over millions of years to need those patches of fire-killed trees. So that's necessary ecologically, but that's a different conversation than conversation about community protection. And so I think, from a community protection standpoint, the differences in fire regimes are not nearly really not that relevant, because the common denominator is fire is going to happen. It's going to happen in the east and the west and the north and the south. It's going to happen. And if the community is not protected, the community is going to be impacted. And so we know how to dramatically reduce those impacts and dramatically increase protection, save homes and save lives. And that's what we need to do. And those lessons are largely the same, whether you're talking about Gatlinburg, Tennessee, or one of the mountain towns in the Sierra Nevada.
Yeah, I would only dovetail exactly what Dr. Hansen just said, in that when you're talking about structural ignition vulnerabilities, it's going to be the same regardless of the fire regime you're within. So it's things like dead debris in really vulnerable, siding to wall junctions, or things on your deck, what's underneath your deck, what's on your roof lines, what kind of vents are you using? All of these components and assemblies within the home itself, they're not going to change regardless of the fire regime or the level of risk you're at. It's always going to be the same. It's always trying to find those areas of flammable surface as well as penetration to the interior of the home that you're trying to reduce. That's, just adding to what Dr. Hansen already said.
Absolutely. And I think this, your guys' discussion just kind of answers this question that was submitted about, and just to frame it, isn't the hyper focus on fuel buildup a bit misleading when talking about general wildfire risks and patterns across the region? I think with our discussion right now, we can come to a uniform answer on that yes, this is more about protecting your home and the community, regardless of where you are. The regime is not going to, change those precautions we still need to take. So not to speak for our presenters, but I think that kind of our previous discussion answers that last question that was submitted. Let's see. This is a great question here. To what extent is the discontinuation of widespread seasonal burning by Native people a factor in the increase in fire frequency and intensity? And if you guys need me to repeat that, please let me know.
Well, I'll just briefly respond on that. Like I mentioned, that we have less fire in our forests, generally speaking, than we had historically before fire suppression, before colonization. And we really, from my standpoint, the answer is more fire, and it's three different types, and they all have a different role and different time and place. One is, wildland fire use. Some people call it managed wildfire. I prefer the term wildland fire use, and that basically just letting more lightning strikes burn in more remote forests. For resource benefit, for habitat. Another, of course, is prescribed fire, set by controlled burns, also known as controlled burns, set by agencies. And the third, of course, is Native American cultural burning. And, all of these have been suppressed by modern policies. And there's a lot of discrimination and an ugly history of discrimination there. And that continues today. And I believe those policies need to be reversed, and there needs to be greater allowance for Native American cultural burning, as well as, of course, wildland fire use and prescribed fires in certain areas, like an additional buffer around communities. So I think that there's a lot of common cause here, honestly.
I have nothing more to add to what Dr. Hansen just said.
Perfect. Okay. Let's see. Give me 1 second here. Okay. We have a question here about, I think this one is for Dr. Hansen again. As you know, one of the most challenging issues that we are now facing and is happening around saving the giant sequoias. Logging interests teaming up with sympathetic agencies such as the U.S. Forest Service have wrapped their post-fire and thinning projects within sheep's clothing, creating hysteria about saving giant sequoias. As a result, progressive pro-forest allies have jumped on the bandwagon, including, sadly, some NGOs. What's the best single message to point to drive home to blunt this emotional-driven movement? Example, regressive Save Our Sequoias bill supported by many well-meaning Democrats.
Yeah, well, it's a good question. The Save Our Sequoias Act is a really bad bill. It's basically a logging bill, but I think there are people who have signed on to it not really quite realizing how many bedrock environmental laws will be rolled back by that bill, and how much logging of old growth trees, even giant sequoias could be logged. It could be clear cut. Any kind of logging could be allowed into that bill, and no laws. But I think what's driving it is a genuine and real concern and love for giant sequoias and the giant sequoia forests. I've been, hiking and camping in these forests ever since I was a kid. I've been researching them as a scientist. I love the giant sequoia forests and trees and ecosystems as well. And I guess what I would say is this: what I believe is emerging from the evidence is fundamentally good news and hopeful news. There's no question that there has been some mortality of mature giant sequoias from some of the recent fires. That is definitely a fact. It is also a fact that there has always been mortality of mature sequoias from large mixed intensity fires. That's not a new phenomenon. It's been happening for millions of years. And the question is, where are we at in terms of the overall pattern? So about 90% of the giant sequoia groves have burned. The area in the giant sequoia groves have burned over the past 20 years. There's actually relatively little that hasn't burned in the past 2 decades. Of that 90% that's burned, about 86% is low and moderate intensity, and where there's almost no mortality of mature sequoias. Contrary to what some of the government scientists have said, what we found is they've said there's significant mortality in moderate severity. I think they said 24% mortality of mature sequoias. We've looked at that. The trees that they recorded as dead were actually dead before the fires occurred, by and large, and some of them they record as dead are actually alive, because sequoias can look dead after a fire, but then they produce new green crowns from epicormic branching and flushing. They actually recreate their green crown structure in many cases, not always, but often. And so oftentimes trees are assigned in the category of dead after the fire, but they're not. And they're saying, hey, look, I'm still here. So we're basically finding almost no mortality in low and moderate. And even in the high severity areas, most of those areas do not have very high mortality of giant sequoias. They may have high mortality of white fir and incense cedar and other conifer species, but of mature sequoias, the mortality is actually relatively low oftentimes. Now, sometimes it's 100% in patches, but oftentimes in high severity, it can be less than 30 or 40%. So bottom line is that this notion that 20% of mature sequoias have been killed in recent fires, that's not true. It's much, much lower than that. It might be 7 or 8%. It's significant, but it's much lower. And to me, what the bigger factor is that we are now seeing levels of natural reproduction after these fires, especially in the moderate and high intensity fire patches, levels of natural sequoia reproduction that we haven't seen in much more than a century, because we've been so good at keeping fire out of these sequoia groves. And the fact is, giant sequoias need mixed intensity fire, especially moderate and high intensity fire patches, to effectively reproduce. These are serotinous species, and they need mixed intensity fire, especially at the higher end. And now we're seeing, these are groves that have been slowly dying off since the 1880s, 1890s with the lack of fire. The big ones have been dying off just from age and other factors. And there's been almost no reproduction, almost completely absent. Now we have hundreds, several hundred, in some cases thousands of beautiful, rapidly growing new sequoias per acre across thousands and thousands of acres in these recent fires. And so I would just tell people, this is good news, take the win. And, we don't need to go in there and manage. The worst thing we could do is go in there with post-fire logging and trample all those sequoia seedlings with the logging machinery, thinking that we're doing good. It's not going to reduce future fire risk. Post-fire logging tends to increase future fire risk. Lots of research has found that, including my own. And sequoias don't need our help. I mean, they have an evolutionary history with mixed intensity fire that goes back 90 million years. They've got this covered.
Awesome. Thank you for that, Chad. And then this question, which I think might be our last one here for today's presentation, is for Dr. Barrett. How could economic and demographic disparities in terms of home risk exposure be addressed if and when federal and state funding for home hardening, et cetera, become more available?
Yeah, I would respond by saying that's a great question, first and foremost, and that subsidies are needed for homeowners. I think it's unfair to require homeowners across the board, regardless of what kind of socioeconomic demographic they have, that they need to meet higher mitigation measures when you may be talking to a single mother with 3 different jobs. There is money at the federal level, and it needs to be reinvested in a more deliberate, strategic way to provide the incentive for homeowners to be able to afford these mitigation measures and to make communities better prepared. It's just being a little heavily lopsided, as Dr. Hansen earlier referenced, towards forest treatments with very little investment and support to communities that we are seeking to try and protect and reduce risk to. So I think very intentionally and deliberately providing incentives, subsidies, and grants for homeowners who can't afford these mitigation measures, like retrofits or new development, to be able to meet these higher levels of wildfire resistance that we know work, then it needs to be more equitably distributed from the top levels down.
Strongly agree.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. There were a couple of questions asking about call to action initiatives and how we can work towards bringing this attention to our legislators, both in the House and the Senate. And I would address all of those questions by saying direct yourself both to Dr. Barrett and Dr. Hansen's personal information that they're willing to share with you, and then also like both of our organizations, the John Muir Project and Headwaters Economics. This is an amazing opportunity we have here to really galvanize our movements together and push this into a better, more forefronted facing position for Congress. And so please always check out our social medias, our websites for both Headwaters Economics and John Muir Project. We always have action alerts going out, and those are the best ways I feel like to get involved. So thank you so much, everyone, for being here today. And thank you to our presenters. It was a lovely discussion, and we will have those follow-up materials sent out within 3 days, and this recording will be available on our YouTube channel. So thank you so much, everyone, and have a wonderful rest of the day.